In today's video, we'll create a sci-fi cityscape. We'll try to go for a cyberpunk aesthetic, but it's actually going to be really simple and really quick. So without any waste of time, let's actually begin the tutorial. We're going to be using geometry nodes, so let's bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and then switch this over from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, after which we can select the group input and tap X to delete it. Now we want to create a plane on which we're going to add in all of the buildings. So to add in a plane, we're going to press Shift A and search for the grid. Now the grid comes in with 3 subdivisions by default, which you can see by going over to the wireframe view over there. But if we want to increase more, we could increase this just like that. As you can see, we're getting way more subdivisions. But instead of doing that, we're going to use a subdivide mesh node. And before we do that, we're going to increase the size to something much larger, maybe something like 20 by 20, so that we get a much larger grid just like this. Once we have that set, let's use a subdivide mesh node. So let's go ahead and press Shift A, search for the subdivide mesh, and plug that in after the grid. Now we can increase the number of levels to 2 or 3. It's really up to you, but for my case right now, I'm going to keep it at 2, and then I'm going to subdivide a few of these even further. So let's go ahead and do that by pressing Shift A and searching for a separate geometry so that we can just select certain faces to be subdivided once again. Let's plug that in right over there, and we have to ensure that we're separating all of the faces only. So let's change this from point to face, and for the selection, let's use a random value. So press Shift A, search for a random value, and ensure that you change this from float to boolean because we want it to be either true or false. Now I don't want 0.5 of them to be selected. I want maybe roughly a little less than half, so I'll go with 0.4, which is a bit less than half. And again, I'll just give it a random seed. Now I'll press Shift A and search for another subdivide mesh node, or I can just select this subdivide mesh and press Shift D to duplicate it. Again, I don't want it to be this subdivided, so I'll just decrease the levels to 1. Now I want the original ones to also be present, so let's press Shift A, search for a join geometry, and plug that in after the subdivide mesh, and also take this inverted socket and plug that right into the joint geometry. So now we have the old squares as well as the new slightly smaller squares. I want each of these squares to essentially become a pillar or a tower. To do that, we're going to first switch over from our wireframe view to our solid view, and in fact, just to see it, we'll keep it in our wireframe view, and I'll press Shift A and search for an extrude mesh node. Now we've done this multiple times in many other videos. What we essentially want to do is create an inset for every face. To create that inset, we'll add in the extrude mesh node, but we'll change the offset value to a value of 0. We have to ensure that individual is checked, and now we can take all of the new faces that were created and scale them down using this top selection. So to scale down the faces, we can press Shift A and search for a scale elements node. And remember, we have to ensure that the elements that's being scaled is face. And now we can take the top and plug that into the selection. Now we can reduce the scale to something like 0.9, and you can see how we have the faces inset. Maybe a little smaller will also work. Let's go with 0.8. Now that we have that inset, let's go ahead and switch back to our viewport shading of solid, and let's lift this up. To lift it up, we're just going to extrude the mesh once again, and just like before, we're going to use this same top selection. So let's plug that into the selection, and let's increase the offset value. But you see right now we get all of them to be the exact same height. Of course, that's not what I want. So in order to randomize this, I can press Shift A, search for a random value node, and plug that into the offset. But I want the min and max values to be slightly different. So I'll change the min to maybe 0.5, and I can have the max at something really high. Let's go with a value of 5. So that is now my entire cityscape. Remember, this is completely procedural, so you can at any point of time change the seed, or you can increase the number of subdivisions to create more buildings, lesser buildings, so on and so forth. And in fact, you can actually repeat this section of separating and subdividing and joining again multiple times to create various sizes of buildings. But I think for a normal urban landscape, just this is good enough. So right now I have the first subdivision at 3 and the second one just at 1. So now that I have this cityscape created, we have to ensure that we get some type of tips or tops for a few of these buildings just to break up the evenness on top. So in order to do that, again, I want to select a few of these tops. We already have the tops over here, but I want to select only a few of them. So to do that, let's press Shift A and search for a Boolean math node. And now we can have the top selection and ensure that it's another random value. So let's select this, press Shift D, change this from float to Boolean, change the seed and plug this value into the Boolean over there. We'll reduce the probability down to something like 0.3. So now we're selecting only a few of these tops. On those few tops, I want to again do this entire insetting followed by extrusion. So let's do that again. To inset, remember, we take this extrude mesh node, press Shift D, plug that in right over here. Make sure that the selection is this selection that we created. Offset is 0. So now we have a face on top of the face. But to inset it, we have to go ahead and take the scale elements, press Shift D, plug that in right here, and take the tops and plug that into the selection. Now let's keep it at maybe 0.8. That should be good enough. But now we're going to extrude the mesh once again, and we're going to ensure that it's the top that's being selected. And now we can just offset it up. But maybe we don't want it to be offset by the same value every time. So we're going to use another random value node. So let's select this, press Shift D, change this from Boolean to float, plug that into the offset. And this time the min can be maybe 0.2 and the max could be maybe something like 0.5. We don't have to have it too large. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and ensure that these areas that have been extruded, as you can see, are no longer just these cubes, but instead they kind of join together at the tip. So to do that, we're going to use another scale elements node. So press Shift D. We're going to use this top as the selection, and we can just scale this down so that you get this type of a top, which is pretty cool for now. So now that you have this set, I want to go ahead and give all of these different materials. So let's first start off by setting the materials according to the different objects that there are. Remember, we need at least one material for all of these sides. We need one material for all of the roofs, and we need one material for the absolute floor. So the way I'm going to do this is, if at all it's facing the side, we'll give it the sides material. But if it's not facing the side and it's not at a value of 0, it'll get the roof material. So that way, even these triangles or pyramids that we've added on top of certain roofs will also get that roof material, and even the plain ones will get the same roof material. Apart from that, the floor will get a different material. So the first thing that we'll do is start off by giving a material for the floor. Let's press Shift A, search for set material, and plug that in right over here. And remember, we have 3 materials, so let's use 3 set materials. So press Shift D twice and bring in the 3 set materials. Now we need 3 separate materials. So let's go to the material properties and rename this first material to maybe floor. Then we can add in a new material by pressing this plus button and then pressing this new button, and now changing this material name to maybe building sides. And finally, the last one, again by pressing this plus and the new, we can add in something for the roofs. Now for these set materials, let's go ahead and just choose the floor, and then the building sides, and finally the roofs. Now we have to select just the building sides for the building sides and the roofs for the roofs. So we're going to do that using some vector math and just the positions or the normals. So for the building sides, let's go ahead and press Shift A and search for a normal node. Now this is going to give us a vector that points outward. We can see which direction this vector is pointed by comparing it to another vector in a known direction. So the way we do that is using the dot product. If you want to know exactly what's happening with the dot product, definitely check out this video over here where we go into a deep dive and visual explanation of the vector math node. For now, let's press Shift A and search for a dot product, which is present in the vector math node, and then just plug the normal in over there and change this from add to dot product. Then for the second vector, we need to ensure that we're checking on the z direction. So let's make this a value of 1. Now the reason why we're checking whether it's on the z axis is so that we can state that if it is not on the z axis, then it'll get the sides material. So let's go ahead and compare if this is giving us a value of 1. For that, we press Shift A, search for a compare node, and we're simply going to check if it is equal to a value of 0. Now remember, the dot product will be a value of 1 if it is perfectly in the direction of the vector that we're comparing it with over here, which is the z direction. So anything that is perfectly pointed towards the z direction will have a value of 1 as the output over here. But things that are not perfectly in the z direction or perfectly at 90 degrees, like for example all of these pyramids, they'll have a value that ranges between 0 to 1. However, everything that is perfectly at 90 degrees with the z-axis, such as all of the sides, will have a value of 0. So we could check this with an integer as well. It doesn't have to be a float with an epsilon value, which is like an error value, but we'll keep a small error value just in case. It's completely all right. Now we're going to take this result and plug that into the selection. That's because right now we're checking if it has a value of 0, then the result is true. And as we said, it'll have a value of 0 whenever it is exactly at 90 degrees to the z-axis, which are all of our sides. So that seems perfectly all right. Now we need to figure out how we can select just the roofs. So remember, we said that we'll select the roofs for everything that is not this particular building's sides and is above the ground floor. So in order to do that, we have to ensure that this comes before the building sides. So let's press Alt click to just remove it. Remember, you need Node Wrangler enabled to be able to do that. And then we can just plug that in right over there. Now let's go ahead and select the roofs. For that, we want to see the position and we want to ensure that the position is greater than 0. So that's very simple to do. All we do is press Shift A, search for a position node, and then we can search for a compare node. But remember, we want to compare only the Z value. So we have to go ahead and separate out the XYZ before we do this. So let's search for a separate XYZ, and now we know the exact Z position. If the Z position is greater than 0, only then should this set material kick in. Now we can keep a little bit of an error value, so we'll keep it at anything greater than 0.1. We'll take this roof material. So now that we have this, we should be able to have the 3 separate materials, and we can start with actually texturing the different materials. So in order to do that, we'll first start off by switching our viewport shading to rendered. Then we'll go to our output properties or our render properties and switch on bloom as well as screen space reflections. Then we'll go over to our world settings and change this background color all the way to black. And then we'll go ahead and just select our default light, press Alt G to clear its location, and then GZ to just lift it up for the time being. We will be removing this light and making changes to it later on, but just to enable a little bit of visibility, we'll keep it there for now. Now let's select our geometry node object and switch our geometry node workspace to the shader editor. First off, we have to select the material that we want to work with. I want to start off by working with the sides because it's the most complex material. So let's go over to the material properties and just choose the building sides. Now for the building sides, I want it to be completely metallic. So let's increase the metallic all the way to 1, which will give these really nice reflections if you have screen space reflections switched on. We'll reduce the roughness down to maybe something like 0.3 so that they're even more reflective. Maybe a value of 0.35 will also do good. Now we want to essentially give in some amount of bump so that we get these sort of window-like appearances, which we can control using this normal input. For that, let's press Shift A and search for a bump node, but we have to actually control the height of the bump using some texture. We're going to go ahead and use a Voronoi texture for this. And again, if you haven't checked out the demystifying Voronoi texture node, definitely check that out because we explain exactly what all the output properties and inputs of the Voronoi texture does in very, very detail. So there's a lot to learn over there. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. For the time being, we'll press Ctrl T with the Node Wrangler enabled so that we get the texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and we can switch over from generated to object. Then we'll Ctrl Shift click the Voronoi texture so that we see what we have, and we can start playing around by starting off with reducing the randomness to 0 and changing this from Euclidean to Chebyshev so that we get square-like textures which will fit our windows much better. Now to increase the contrast, we can press Shift A and search for a color ramp node. Remember, you can always use math nodes and things like that, but I'll just use a color ramp node for simplicity at the moment. Now I'll bring the black in and I'll also bring the white in just so that we get it nice and contrasty, and that looks great to be the windows. But again, I don't want these to be visible like this. I want these to be as bumps. So let's plug this color into the height and now Control Shift click the principled BSDF to see what we have. Now you can see that we get these really nice bumps that are present. You might like it the way it currently is, where it seems to be pushing outward. If you want, you can always press this invert button and it'll seem like those areas are going in, which I think would make sense if you have panes of windows. Those are the areas where the window panes aren't really there. So they should be going in just like this. So I really like this look. We'll keep it just like this for now. Remember, you can always increase the number or decrease the number by playing around with the scale. Maybe you want to have many more windows. You can reduce the scale or increase it to something like 10. And I think that looks a lot better. Now that we have all of these little windows created, we can start giving it some amount of color. In order to do that, we're going to actually play around with the emission. And for that, we're going to use some more Voronoi textures. Remember, if you take a Voronoi textures color, you can see that you'll get these little squares that are present at the exact same size as the distance outputs over here. So each square will match up with one of the windows that you just created. However, we don't want the entire window to be completely covered like this. So we're going to use the color output to literally color in the actual windows. But we'll use the distance output with a different color ramp to actually determine which areas will become lit up. So let's duplicate this color ramp node and plug the distance into the factor. But this time, instead of going from black to white, we'll go from white to black and we'll in fact change this from linear to constant so that we get a sharp fall off. Now let's press Ctrl Shift click to actually view it, and you can see everything just becomes white. So now we're gonna go ahead and just bring this black in till we get just these little white squares, and we're gonna make sure that we don't bring it in so much that certain areas completely become black. So we have to be very careful with exactly where we go. Of course, if you do want, you can have it such that a few faces are black and have no windows. That's completely up to you, but I'll keep it just at this edge before that happens. So once we have that, we're going to use this as a mask to determine what colors go on each of these windows. But before that, I don't want all of the windows to be on or all of the lights for every single window to be on. So I'm going to switch a random number of them off. And in order to do that, we're going to multiply this with another color ramp that's taken out from the color value. So let's go ahead and press Shift D to duplicate this color ramp node. Now let's take this color output and plug that in to the factor. Now let's search for another math node, and we're going to set the math from add to multiply. Now remember, you could be using a mixed color node, but because we're dealing with just black and white values, you can use just the multiply node as well. So let's plug this in right over there. And now you can see a random number of them completely switch off. That's happening because we're taking this color output and we're seeing a random number of them, or at least what the brightness of each of them are, and switching off a random number. You can switch off more by bringing this black slider in, or you can switch more on by moving this black slider out. I'm going to keep very few of them on, so something like that should be good. Let's change the position to a solid 0.3, and that looks good enough for me. Now I need to give these actual colors. In order to give them the color, we're going to go ahead and search for a white noise texture. Now again, if you don't know exactly what this white noise texture does, do check out this video over here where we actually explain what the function of the white noise texture is, and once you watch that video, you'll be able to understand exactly why what we do works perfectly with the white noise texture. Essentially, the white noise texture could be skipped in this step, but using it will result in a better distribution, so we're going to use it for now. For the actual vector input, we're going to use the color output from this Voronoi texture, and now we're going to take this color output and plug that through a color ramp that has the 3 different colors that we want. So by duplicating that other color ramp, we can press this plus button to create a new stop, and now we can change the colors. Now Cyberpunk colors are generally these blues and purples, so I'll make one a nice bright cyan, maybe one as a blue, and this last one could be a purple. You could choose maybe a pink somewhere here and there. It's really up to you. So maybe I will add in a little bit of a pink as well. So just another stop and a pink, but I'll keep that fairly less. And now I can take this color and plug that into the factor. Now that I have that set, we want to convert all of the white areas that are coming out from here into this particular color. And we can do that by actually using a mixed color node. But we have to ensure that we change the type from mix to color, and once we plug that in, we can change the factor all the way to 1, and for the color socket B, we can take the color output from here and plug that in. Now you'll see that each window gets a random one of these 4 colors. Now this might look pretty meh right now, but the reason it's looking meh is because we have to go to our render properties and go down to the color management, change it from filmic to AGX. After that, we can go ahead and just plug this result into the color of the principled BSDF, increase the strength to something really high, let's go with 10, and then Control Shift click the principled BSDF to actually get the output. Now because it is AGX, it's going to look a lot more desaturated, and because we have this metallic and we have screen space reflection switched on, you'll get really nice reflections and it'll look just like this. Once you have this set up, you can go ahead and remove the light. So let's remove it. Now this still looks way too bright, so I'm going to switch off a few more windows by just bringing this slider in, and now a lot fewer windows are actually lit up. But I do want them to be a lot brighter, as in more desaturated, so I'm going to increase the strength to maybe something like 20. In order to prevent the bloom from overpowering, I'm going to expand the bloom and just reduce the intensity from 0.05 to 0.02. Now that looks great. The next thing is dealing with the actual roof material and the floor material. So let's go back to the material properties, go ahead and select the roofs. For the roofs, I'm just going to make them very, very metallic, and I'm going to reduce the roughness to maybe 0.25. However, for the actual floor, I'm going to go ahead and make them metallic, but I'm going to keep the roughness at maybe something like 0.6 so that it's not as reflective. Now that shouldn't really be an issue because it's very unlikely that we'll see the floor in the animation that I'm planning on, but for the time being, we can leave it just like that. and I think this looks really cool. Now remember, you have complete control over the actual colors. You can always choose different colors, or if you want more of windows to be pink, you can increase the pink slider. If you want lesser of them to be blue, you can always reduce that. It's completely up to you and your requirements. But for now, I'll leave it at something like this, and I'll start off with the animation. For the animation, I'll go to the output properties. I'll change the resolution to 200%, which will make it 4K. I'll change the frame rate to 60 frames per second. Remember, if you want this blend file as well as the 4K 60 FPS renders, you can always buy this as a product on my Patreon store, or you can join my monthly tiers where you can get the animations or the wallpapers or the blend files based on which tier you join. The end frame I'm going to keep at something like 600 so that it's a 10-second long loop, or maybe 1200 to make it a 20-second long loop. Now, my output folder can be wherever I want it to be. / will store it in the same folder in which my blend file is saved, so make sure that you save your blend file. Then I'll change the file format to FFmpeg video with an encoding changed from Matroska to MPEG-4 and an output quality of perceptually lossless. Then I'll press 0 to go into my camera view, and a really fun feature added in Blender version 4.1 is this little toggle button right here, which you can press to go ahead and navigate just as you would generally, but while moving your camera along. Previously, in other versions of Blender, you'll have to tap N to open up this side panel, go to the View tab over here, and then check this lock camera to view. But now it's present right outside, and you can just toggle it on and off right from here. Then with the actual camera selected, I'm going to go to my camera properties, change the focal length down to something really low. Let's go with 18, and then let's just zoom in to go ahead and maybe get some sort of an angle like this. Once I have a good enough angle, I can go ahead and press Shift A and search for an empty, and I'm just going to choose the plane axis. You can use whichever one you want, but once I add that in, I'll press GZ to lift it up, and then I'll scale it up just so that it's more visible. Now I'll first select my camera, then shift select the empty, and then press Ctrl P and choose set parent to object. Now I can take this empty and just press RZ to rotate the empty, and that's going to give this rotating look around my nice sci-fi city. So in order to make sure that I have the right view, I'll select my camera once again, and in the viewport display, I'll increase passepartout all the way to 1. And remember, once you're done positioning your camera, you should disable this so that you can actually zoom in without having the camera actually move, which just makes life a lot easier. Anyhow, let's increase the timeline by a little bit. Press the back arrow to go to frame 0 and take this empty, tap I, and that should add in keyframes for everything. Then you can go all the way to the last frame, which is frame 1200, and then press RZ 360 and then tap I, and that'll add in keyframes at the 1200th frame as well. Then over here press T and choose linear, and that way you'll get a smooth loop as it goes around the entire city. To make sure that you're actually seeing it at the correct speed, change this from play every frame to frame dropping, and you'll get a realistic idea of how fast you're actually going to be rotating around the city. Now of course, if you want, there are so many other textures that you could add to the top of the different building roofs and things like that. Maybe some noise textures to play around with the roughnesses and things like that. But all in all, I think this is good enough, and you can actually mess around with a few final touches, such as adding in a depth of field by again choosing your camera or selecting it from the outliner, going to the camera and switching on depth of field. You can expand this and just reduce this f-stop to increase the actual blur of the depth of field, and you can play around with the focus distance to focus on a place that you actually want to focus on. But for now, I'll keep the f-stop at maybe something like 0.8 and the focus distance at something like 7, and I think that will be good enough. If at all you want a background, you can go ahead and play around with it. So you could go to the world properties and actually change this from object to world so that you can play around with the nodes. If you can't see the nodes, just tap A to select everything and period on your numpad to centralize them. And in fact, I want to give this a slight gradient that goes from a dark blue to maybe a slightly darker purplish color. Let's see how that looks. Let's press Shift A, search for a gradient texture, and Control Shift click to actually view the gradient. Now, of course, I want it to be linear, but I want it to be flat on the horizon. So let's press Control T to get in texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Let's switch over from generated to object. Then let's just rotate this about any of the axes. Let's try the y-axis by 90 degrees, and that looks great. So now we do have the gradient right there. Let's just reduce this scale down to something like 0.8 so that it becomes a much smoother gradient, and I want to bring it down, so I'll move it on the x-axis just so that it comes down like probably something like that. Now I need to give the two colors for it, so let's press Shift A, search for a color ramp node. Let's plug that in, and now the areas that were black, I want to change them to be, as I said, a maybe dark bluish color. So we'll go with something very dark, and the other areas can be a very dark purple or pinkish color. So again, ensure that it is a very dark. Maybe we can switch it up to have the purple at the bottom and the blue on top. Change it from linear to ease, reduce the brightness of the purple. And I don't actually want that to be lighting up my scene, so I'm gonna plug that. Alright, so we had a quick Blender crash while I was recording. I should have taken my own advice and saved it back then. However, I hadn't saved it, so I recreated everything to about the position where we are. And again, we're going to use a similar technique that we have done in multiple videos before, because we want there to be the gradient in the background, as you can see over here, but we don't want that to be what's lighting up the scene. So we're going to use a mix shader node, and we're going to use a light path node. So we're going to duplicate this background node by pressing Shift D. We're going to ensure that this color remains as black, and we're going to plug that into the shader. Then we're going to press Shift A and search for a light path node. And of course, we have a demystification of the light path node as well. So do check that out if you haven't already. But we can take this is camera array and plug that into the factor. Now it seems like our camera is seeing black, but everything is lit by the texture. So we're going to go ahead and just flip this by plugging that into the first socket and this into the second. Now we have the nice gradient present in our camera view, whereas it's not actually lighting up the scene, which is exactly what we wanted. And I think that's actually all there is to creating this animation. Once you're happy with the way everything looks, you can go ahead and press render animation. I hope this quick tutorial actually taught you quite a bit. I don't know how quick it was because I did end up doing a lot of things that I hadn't actually planned on for this video, but hopefully there was a lot to learn and you actually stayed for the entire video. If you actually did stay this far, thank you so much for watching. I release videos like this approximately once a week now, but I will try and increase the pace at which I upload videos in the coming few days. So until my next videos come out, thank you so much for watching once again. Keep creating and don't forget to check out all of the previous videos on my channel and stay creative.